Good morning, sir. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, friends.
Hello. Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'm audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So our guest speaker is with us. Noori ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, Ramnath, I can hear you. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, sure, ma'am. Okay. So, ma'am, shall I start now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Respected Director, Student Welfare, TMU, Professor M.K. Singh, sir, Principal, Faculty of Education, TMU, Professor Rashmi Mehrotra, ma'am, our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Fatima Noori, ma'am, Principal, Sri Prem Prakash Memorial College, Dr. Ashok Kumar Lakera, sir, Principal, Tirthankar Adinath College of Education, Dr. Ratnesh Jain, sir, our lovely faculty members and dear students. I, Dr. Ramnath Kesarwani, heartily welcome you all in this online guest lecture, which is on a reflection upon the features of modern poetry. Though this lecture is primarily for the students of English literature, still those interested in literature and society in general can also have a thoughtful experience regarding the impact of society on poetry and the vice versa. As we all know that the poetry is the oldest form of literature and it has developed with the passage of time regarding the very mood of contemporary society. Generally, poetry is considered, as William Wordsworth has said, the expression of feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. This idea very much suggests that the function of poetry is primarily to delight. Whereas, if we talk about another critic, Matthew Arnold, so he says that poetry is the criticism of life, which gives the meaning that poetry has not only the function of delighting, but at the same time, it has also the function of instructing the society. So, on this ground, if we see the development of English poetry in a chronological order, we find that poetry has been changing time to time, both in its form and content. If we look at the classical poetry, so we see that the classical poetry, okay, sorry for interruption. So I was talking about the development of poetry in the context of English literature. So we see that when classical poetry was being written, so it was mainly based on the heroic nature. So it was the flavor of heroic poetry that was enjoyed by the people of Greco-Roman period. Whereas if we talk about the Renaissance period, so Renaissance poetry was very much suffused in love. Talking about the neoclassical age produced more satirical poetry with the intention of commenting on social follies, whereas romantic poets fell in love with the beauty of nature. On the other hand, when we move towards the Victorian society, we find that Victorian society very much fluctuated between religion and science, lost in Sikh hurry and divided aims. Thus, the poetry of that time addressed the human tendency of doubt, dispute, distractions, and fear. Now, modern age turned more turbulent with the horrific advent of two world wars that left people orphaned of morality, trust, and humanitarian feelings. So, today's discussion on poetry is going to be focused on the modern features of poetry, the features of modern poetry, on which Dr. Noori will be enlightening us with her thoughtful ideas. Now, before calling our guest for the lecture, let me tell in brief about her because it is a matter of immense pleasure for us that today we have the eminent guest speaker, Dr. Fatima Noori, with us. Dr. Noori is presently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English, Jagat Tarang Girls PG College, University of Allahabad, Prayagraj. She is a versatile personality in the field of literature and has keen interest in teaching and research. If I talk about her academic adventures so far, I take delight to tell you that Dr. Noori has been the Fulbright Nehru Doctoral Fellow at Hamilton College, Clinton, New York State, America. She has also been the Senior Research Fellow at the University of Allahabad, Prayagraj, and completed her PhD on Poems of Exile and Diaspora, a study of Aga Shahid Ali's poetry. If I talk about her area of specialization, so she has specialization on poetry, diaspora, English literature, and post-colonial literature. She has also published several research papers in national and international journals and books, and actively participated in many seminars, workshops, and conferences both at national and international level. Now, without any further delay, may I request Dr. Noori to deliver her lecture and enlighten us and our student with her interactive session. Dr. Noori ma'am, please, now it's over to you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. But first of all, let me thank the principal of the college, Dr. Lakhera, for inviting me here, and of course, Dr. Kesavani for giving me this opportunity to interact with you students. Also, I'm glad that Dr. Kesavani, I think Dr. Kesarwani, you need to mute yourself because I can hear my own echo. Okay. So uh, it was a wonderful idea on part of Dr. Kesarwani to give you a very brief but a very precise idea of how the poetry was in the different eras of English literature. So just a very quick recap because I think since all of you are graduation students, you're already into that you have some kind of a historical perspective. English literature is generally divided into time periods according to the political changes in England. So we begin with the age of Chaucer, where English was still developing, and then we move on to the Elizabethan age, which is which is further divided into subsections, and then we have the neoclassical age. Again, it has some subsections. Then the Romantics, and then the Victorian, and then comes the modern poetry. Age of Chaucer, basically, the society was into formation, and hence Chaucer becomes a very important poet there. In fact, we know him as the father of English poetry because he gave us the language as well as a very clear glimpse into what was the English society all about. The language was coming into formation, and the society was coming into formation from the various Roman and Greek influence and French and Greek influences. By Shakespeare, you have established monarchies, and there was Renaissance, and people were looking back at the classical ideas, and man became the measure of all things. And the poetry and literature of that era reflects that attitude, because that is what literature and poetry is supposed to do. It gives us a perspective of how the society is moving and what are the yearnings and the aspirations of a particular society. When we move on to the neoclassical age, in Elizabethan age, it was basically the courtly love that was being talked about. Neoclassical poetry also sticks to the court, but there is a lot of satire and mock epics because the society has gained certain artificiality. Then we move on to the Romantics, because the Romantics were fed up of the artificiality. They rushed to the nature, and they started talking about mountains and rivers and the bird songs and the beauty of the man who is apart from the court, he who's untouched from the court. They are thoroughly disgusted by the courtly life, and they keep on talking about the beauty of nature and how rusticity is also to be celebrated. And then you have the Victorian age. The Victorian age is basically again about a tussle between doubt and faith. because we have new learnings. We have a very strong and established monarchy under Queen Victoria, who happens to be a female, which the Victorian English people were initially found it a little difficult, but under her headship, the society had a rather stable political scene, and there were a lot of scientific as well as industrial progress. But the scientific progress and of course the colonization also started during that era. So the English people were full of pride in a certain way, but since the colonization did bring them some stories, because when you read the romantic novels of Jane Austen, you find in the background that they are talking about the colonization. When you read Emily Bronte, you find the mad woman in the attic. There is some hint of the society which is not very correct. There's some slight hint of that. From there, when we move on to the Victorian, we see that the Victorian society is uh, uh, is pendulating between doubt and faith. When we look at somebody like Browning, who's full of optimism, but then there is also Tennyson, who's talking about the courage and the bravery and the chivalry of the Victorian man. And then by the end of the Victorian age, we have someone like Matthew Arnold, from where most of the critics trace the beginning of the modern poetry or the modern literature or the modern times, because Arnold was one person who could see through the tradition of the English literature and the English poetry, and he knew that there were a lot of cracks in the society as well as literature. So on up till say Browning, poetry was supposed to just entertain people and educate people. But from Arnold, we see a very definitive shift in the perspective of how poetry is to be looked at. Arnold too believed in the didactic nature of literature. He, in fact, said that there will come a time when literature will replace religion as well as philosophy. We would no longer need religion or some kind of a coercive force and some kind of a moral force. We would no longer need philosophy, some people who would give us perception about how things should be, what is the nature of things. Just and only literature, that is stories and songs and poems and drama and theater, would be enough to cater to the human population, to give them a direction and to make them feel and to morally bind them into a unit. So that was Matthew Arnold's faith in literature. It does not really hold true, as you all know. In fact, from there on, the diversification in humanities and literature and philosophy and all the fields of studies had moved on to really. To great heights. We have conflict studies today, and we have post-colonial studies today, and we have culture studies today, and we have film studies today. So from there on, we have actually diversified even more, and we have this inter departmental or inter subject kind of things where we are trying to study the effect of one field, or how the different field of studies, traditional field of studies, are actually interconnected. Having said that, let's come on to what modern poetry is all about and what are the features. So I'll share the screen. I have a PPT prepared for you all. I hope it works. Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am. Is it visible?
Okay. So to understand the modern poetry, first of all, I think the idea of the time period is slightly tricky, because, as I said, many people trace the beginning of modern poetry from Arnold himself, but most of the people think it begins from the year 1910 with the end of the Kings Edward and George. In fact, 1910 we have the beginning of the First World War already in place. So 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria ends. From 1901 to 1910, we have Edward VII, I believe, and then we have small little reigns of King George fifth and sixth. But however, most of the people trace it from 1890s, the age of aestheticism, the age of Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater, mostly because these were the people who talked about how art should be for art's sake. They gave the dictum art for art's sake, and this was supposed to cater to the idea that art is to be studied not for any moral or didactic purpose, but basically for its own pleasure. And the idea is that the reader of a good of literature and the student of literature should have standards for art within its own idea, not because it teaches you something, not because it tells you a moral idea, not because it conveys to it makes you a better person, but mostly because art is a category in itself. It basically begins with the shattering down of the ideas of enlightenment. What were the ideas of enlightenment? In very simple terms, the enlightenment believed in the power of reason. The enlightenment believed in scientific progress, in scientific methodology. They said that if you do this, the result will be this. If you do A, then you will definitely get if you add a plus a, then you will get a square or 2a. The modern times, with the advent of a lot of socio-political forces, which I'll be talking about, shattered this particular idea. There was no longer that firmness, or the belief in the system was no longer there. And why was it not there? Because of certain changes in the society. Okay, so what was happening in during the Victorian age? We all know that Darwin came up with the theory of man's evolution from ape, that came out in the year 1859. Also, we have another very important geographer and philosopher called Charles Lyell, who gave the idea of geological evidences of the antiquity of man, again in the year 1863, a little apart from the origin of species, which talks about the tectonic theory, like the mountains developing slowly, evolving little by little, and not being formed by the by the strike of Lord Almighty. Because the book of Genesis tells us कि एक दिन भगवान उठे और उन्होंने कहा कि आज यहाँ पर पहाड़ होगा, आज यहाँ पर नदी होगी, आज सूरज होगा, आज चांद होगा. Charles Darwin and George Lyell said, no, that is not how life evolved. It evolved slowly from different species. The organisms evolved over time. This led to the pendulating of the doubt between doubt and faith in the Victorian era itself. So much so that the writers were talking about it in really tragic terms. But that had already shaken the faith and the system in the Victorian society, and uh, uh, this kind of came to a full swing by the modern times. Another very important two very important events that actually led to the beginning of the modern times were the Education Act of 1870. The Education Act of 1870 makes it compulsory for all English students to have all English children from the age of 5 to 13 to get an education. That means the English society in general could now read and write, which was a very important idea. How I'll talk about it a little further. And then finally, England, we all know, had colonized 1/3 of the world by during the Victorian era. But by the year 1899, this was a war that England was fighting in Africa, in a region called Boer. So it is called the Boer War. And this war went on for 3 years. At the end of the war, England did win the war, but it had to suffer very heavy losses in terms of the lives and also in terms of the resources. It lost a lot of money, and also it lost a lot of English lives. So people were really and thoroughly disgusted. The very foundation of colonization was shaken. People started developing doubts about the idea of colonization itself. Also, major idea is that in by the year 1911, the agrarian nature of the English society had totally evaporated. They almost 70% of the population was now living in urban areas, were now living in cities. So the rustic life, the country life, the village life, or poets like Hardy and poets like Matthew Arnold, who were talking about the beauty of nature, poets like Tennyson, they were really outdated, because the majority population could read. They were living in very horrible conditions in the cities. Why horrible? Because the industrialization has hit its peak. There were a lot of industries in England, but there were no, human rights or proper rights for the workers. Marx was already on the scene, and he had given the idea that the base of any society is an economic base, how much you earn, whether you're rich or whether you're poor. And he divided the society between the rich and the poor, and then the emerging middle class with the emergence of the industrialization. So that really changed the way people looked at how the society was. By 1920s and 30s, there were a lot of supporters of Marxism, also fascism, and as well as socialism. So by the time the modern century, the modern period, that is somewhere 1910 and 1914, the beginning of the First World War, came into swing. There were a lot of supporters of the socialism. I'll talk about the suffragette and the world wars again. But the so we have these philosophers in the background. We have the shattering down of the Enlightenment. We have Darwin. We had Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche again was a philosopher who gives the dictum "God is dead." Pretty famous. But what he actually meant was that human beings should no longer rely on the divine powers to help them, because the rationality was not there. If you pray well, if you lead a good life, if you lead a life devoid of sins, then you will have a better future and you will have a better place in heaven. All those ideas were shattered. Why? Because the very concept of heaven and earth was shattered with the evolution, or with the theory of evolution. Then we had thinkers and psychologists and philosophers like Freud and Karl Marx, who talked about the unconscious of the human mind as well as the collective unconscious, which was given by Carl Jung, who said that man is much more than what he believes himself to be, quite contrary to the dictum of Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So Marx says, no, you think where you are not. Again, then again, you have people like James Fraser and William James, pragmatism and the cycle of life. All these people were talking about the ancient pagan rituals, who ancient pagan rituals where people where there was a life cycle, and this did not really cater to the Christian ideology. The Victorian society was highly Christian. They believed in the Christian theology and the Christian system of life, and all that had shattered with the evolution and with the philosophizing of these theories. The year 1922, sometimes the from 1910 to the 1920 is known as the time of high modernism, and in between the year 1922 is known as the year of high modernism, because there was this publication of The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Jacob's Room was a novel by Virginia Woolf, as well as Ulysses, another novel by James Joyce. These were the major writers of the modern age who depicted the features of the modern age. And the modern age is supposed to last up till the year 1939, the end of the war, and sometimes it is also carried till the year till 1940s, because from 1950s we have the beginning of the postmodernism, the end of Second World War, settling down after the turmoil of the wars, brings in a new consciousness among the English people altogether. So we have the postmodern era about it. I'll talk about it a little bit in the end. The idea about modernism is whether is it it's a theory or it's a practice, because modernism is both said to be a way people looked at things, and it is also said to be a philosophy where the way you look at things and the way you organize yourself. But it was very much a practice as well, because it emerged out slowly and it had several branches. There's not one particular idea or one particular person who you could say initiated modernism, or who can be credited with the beginning of modernism. So it basically begins with a lot of isms that I'll be talking about. Basically, with the beginning of the aesthetic movement, which was a movement of visual arts and music and drama, the whole perception and the whole nature and the whole manner of looking at visual arts, painting and sculpture and stuff, music, how it was supposed to be and how people looked at it, how literature was written, how poetries were written, how drama was written and organized, all that changed. The content changed, as well as the manner in which it was written changed. There was a very drastic change in the philosophy. There was very drastic change in the social organization, as well as the structuring of the buildings, the architecture, the way buildings were made, the way buildings were constructed. That also made a huge impact on how people perceive at things. The spatial idea is also contributes to your perception about things. And modernism is all about how art is made, how it is consumed, how people take it, and what should it mean to have an object of art, or what should it mean to produce an object of art. In the background, all this was affected, all this change came in through because of the industrialization, the urbanization, and the advent of a lot of new technologies in England. The outlook of people changed because there was a war going on, brewing up, almost a lot of political changes in Europe, and a lot of new technology that had changed the outlook of people, very heavy industrialization, and from there, very heavy urbanization. So it's very important to understand these ideas, the background, what led to modernization and what is modernization about, to understand the poetry. Because when we read modern poetry, all of us come out of the class saying, why was it ever written? Why was it being taught to us? Why do I have to read it? It doesn't really make sense. The idea of modern poetry is all about not making sense, because it was a time that was not really making sense to the people who were responding to the age, the philosophers and the poets and the dramatists and the writers and the journalists. All these people were not really able to comprehend what was going on in the age. Hence, they started producing a literature which which reflected that feature. So, one of the major features of modern poetry is that it does not really make sense. And it did have a lot of influences from the art movements. The artists and the painters, they were influenced a lot by what was going on in France and in the other parts of Europe. And from there, they were all trying to usher in a idea that the modern life, since it no longer makes sense, it should be reflecting in their art. So you have ideas like cubism or futurism or dadaism or surrealism, expressionism, imagism. All of these are basically art movements, and all of them were talking about a move away from rationality. You look at a piece of art and you don't really make sense of it. So when you look at this is a surrealist painting by a very famous poet called Salvador Dali. Very, very famous. And this particular piece is also very famous, and it is called The Persistence of Memory. That's the name of the painting. And when you look at it, it doesn't really make sense, right? Why? Because it kind of melts. The way the time pieces are melting away, they are not right and intact. You never try and look at the scenery in such a manner, and it has all these objects which doesn't really make sense. In the background you can see perhaps some water and then some kind of cliff, and then there is a tree trunk, but it seems to be jutting out from a block of cement or concrete. So all this doesn't really make sense, and yet it becomes a very famous idea in for the modern man, because it reflects the perception they have of life, they have of society. That's very important for us as students of modern period to understand, because that is how we are going to understand and comprehend the poetry. There was this very famous movement called Imagism, which was basically ushered in by a poet called Ezra Pound, and he brings in translations from Chinese poetry, and he introduces a form called haiku. And this haiku was supposed to have very small and precise images to convey a emotion or a particular aspect of an event in without indulging in the emotionality of it. So therefore we have this very again a very famous piece called In a Station of the Metro, the metro trains that we have. So he writes a poem and he names it gives it a long name, In a Station of the Metro. And when you look at the poem, it's just these two lines: the apparition of these faces in the crowd, the ghostly image of the people in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. That's it. That is the poem. You have no connection between them. You don't know whether the apparition reminds him of the black bough, whether they stand in contrast of the black bough, whether he's moving from one idea to another. It's all left to you. You have to comprehend. You as a reader have to understand what it is all about. This is modern poetry all about. So this idea of imagism was borrowed by more mainstream poets, because Ezra Pound was too difficult for people to last. He was very famous as an influencer. He did influence T.S. Eliot, but more prominent people were T.S. Eliot and W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender. So he did influence them. and they tried to imbibe this particular aspect of poetry, where they're not talking about the emotionality of it, they're not talking about the connectives, they're not talking about what is really making sense, they just give you images. So I will be talking a little bit about the poem that is prescribed in your course, Love Song. It's a very interesting poem, and I think it gives us the feature of modern poetry in a very clear manner. Also, there was another tradition that was around. It was called the automatic writing. So automatic writing was something like writing when you're not really conscious of it. Writing is supposed to be a very an activity where you have to be very focused and concentrate and sit down in the quiet and everything. You let the inspiration come to you. But automatic writing was generally something as if you write out of a dream, or you write under the influence of some drug. So that was again a method that was very much prevalent there. And these ideas were both influencing modernism as well as an expression of modernism. That is where we look for modernism, but that is also again an idea where which had influenced the modernist writers and the modernist writings. Of course, there was symbolism that had been borrowed from France. The idea was pretty popular right from the early ages of studying and reading literature. The movement does become important in the beginning of the modern period, where objects were infused with the Ramnath, are you saying something? I can't hear you. Your this thing is muted.
No, ma'am, please go on.
Okay, okay. How much time do I have?
And still we have 30 minutes.
Okay, okay. So these were the major forces that were influencing modernism as well as an expression of modernism, especially surrealism. Expressionism was all about giving an expression to the angst and the alienation and the anxiety of the modern man, again not making much sense. So when we read and when we the writings by these people who are following these various school of thoughts, and when we look at the paintings of these people who were adherents to these school of thoughts, we see that none of the expressions make a lot of sense. It doesn't come out as something very rational. You cannot say कि ये हुआ फिर ये हुआ फिर ये हुआ फिर ये हुआ. There's no order, because that order has already been shattered by the advent of the war, by the advent of extreme industrialization, which brings in extreme poverty, and people were not really happy with their own conditions. And that the old order of the agricultural society, where God was there to rescue them, to hold for the common man to hold fast into, and they could experience some kind of respite in the idea of uh, 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 religion. That all had already shattered. So therefore we have the modern age, where people were very disoriented and disorganized, and there was a lot of there was this idea of schism, the breakdown or the breaking up or the division. So we have Prufrock, who is a who's talking to himself. There's a divided self that is there. The theoretical ammunition for modernism was provided by T.E. Hume, who was himself a poet, although he did not last very long. And he was the one who waged a war against the romantic and the Victorian ideals of mellifluousness, the exaggeration and the self-expression, the indulgence. Mellifluousness is, excessiveness, ornamentation. all those ideas were no longer held in esteem. He said ki, no, we have to do away with everything, because that is not how the modern man thinks. The modern man thinks very differently. And he focused on discipline, on precision, and on something he called the dry hardness, a phrase that was borrowed from Thomas Hardy. He says ki, our poetry has to be dry and hard. It has to convey precisely how we feel. It has to be disciplined. It has to be very precise. Don't keep on talking about situations and everything. So he also supported the idea of the imagist poetry. And Ezra Pound, again, the person who initiated the imagist movement, he gave the idea of the avant-garde or the advance guard, a term borrowed from military, but the idea was to convey, to make it new. That was the whole philosophy. You make things new, you create a new order, you create a new idea, you create a new object, do away with all the mellifluousness or all the ornamentation from the past. Now, the modern poetry required very close examination. You have to read it several times to understand what is really going on. So when we go back to this particular poem, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Each and every word is infused with meaning. Each and every word conveys something, but there is no connective. So you have to be very clear about, and you have to be very focused on what it is really trying to say. And in the end, it is your interpretation. It is not what the writer is saying, but it is basically your interpretation. Now, one very particular feature of the modern times and the modern poetry is the war poetry, because there was war that was going on in the colonial regions, in the whole of Europe, and then the beginning of the First World War in the year 1914, where people started talking about the horrors and the horrific life at war. Uh, uh, up till the Victorian age, up till the age of Queen Victoria, because all these wars were fought outside England, they were supposed to they were brought into the common man in a much more heroic manner. They were glorified. But when people started fighting war in their home, and the English people became educated because of the Education Act, the women were allowed to go out and work, so much so that they were even given voting rights by the year 1928. They were also able to read and understand what was going on. These soldiers went to the war and they started writing letters back at their houses, and they talked about the horrific situation of the war. That really shook the very foundation of the modern society, or the society that was already prevalent, because there was still a section of poets who were talking about the Edwardian poets, who were talking about the beauty of the Victorian countryside. The how women make houses, and how men go out and earn, or how men go out and make fight in the war, and then they come back into the heath, and then they have beautiful children around, and they have chickens, and they have sheep, and they have cows, and they have this huge grassland where they can enjoy life. All that idea was still lingering in the background. But then when the war happened and people started writing, people started talking about it, the whole idea of a beautiful society really trampled down. People like Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooks, Siegfried Sassoon, Edward Blunden, all these people talked about the horrors of the war, and that led to the shattering down of the whole idea of beauty, as well as a very strong center. The other features, or the more literal features of the modern poetry, are its complexity, its obsessive allusions, its abrupt contrast, its shifting suggestions, its symbolism. and there's a lot of individualism as well as absurdism in modern poetry. I'll be reading a little bit of a love song to talk about these. Then there's alienation, the idea that people don't feel at home, they don't feel comfortable, they always feel as if they are from some other part of the world, they are from some other universe altogether. This schism is the sense of feeling divided. There are always some kind of a division that is going on. They don't feel very rooted, they don't feel as if this is what I'm supposed to do. They're always dwindling between two states of mind, just like true frog. Shall I go? Shall I dare disturb the universe? Should I go inside? Let us go to the muttering half retreats. Let us not go inside. There's a lot of cultural fragmentation that is depicted in the modern poetry. The culture that was there, the like I said, the hearth and the heath of the Victorian countryside, which is talked about by people like Tennyson and Browning and other poets of who were these poets? Rossetti, Jibril Rossetti, people who were talking about the beauty of religion, beauty of a normal life, people who were talking about the beauty of following an order. They were talking about how the kings and the queens and their dictators take care of them. All that was no longer there. The modern poetry talks about how the culture is no longer cohesive, no longer intact, no longer in place. Of course, there was a lot of destruction and fragmentation and a sense of loss in the modern poetry. And most importantly, truth became very relative. What is right? What is the truth? सही क्या है, सच क्या है, वो देखने वाले के परसेप्शन पर पता चलता है. क्यों? Because in the background you have the studies of Freud, who says that when you say something, it's not really the truth. The truth lies deep in your unconscious. You're saying that you like this, but perhaps you don't really like this. You're saying that you hate this person, but perhaps you don't really hate this person. So that led to a lot of fragmentation as well. Again, the modern poetry is all about form. They studied, we have the movement of the new formalist movement, where they made a very close examination, and the text was supposed to convey whatever it was conveying. You don't go outside the text to understand what it was saying. Just stay within the text. Don't talk about the biography of the writer, don't talk about who the poet was, don't talk about how he was influenced into writing something, and yet you have the whole background of war and situation where uh, um, where it was supposed to influence you. So there was a sort of a contradiction in the manner in which modern poetry was read, as well as studied across circles. There was a lot of free verse. People did not stick to the traditional verses. No sonnets, no couplets, no standard terza rima. Nothing of that sort was around. People just wrote in broken syntaxes, disturbed syntaxes, in a rather disorganized manner, small little stanzas where with erratic line divisions. All that was supposed to convey the breakdown of the society. There's a lot of experimentation with the line breaks, the word choices, uh, uh, the, uh, uh, the content. Earlier, people used to talk about, the beauty of uh, the beauty of nature, the beauty of travel, how elated one feels, the submission to an almighty, the power of kings and queens, how they are supposed to display qualities of bravery and chivalry. All those ideas were no longer so prevalent. The modern poet was talking about the fragmentation, the loss, war, what happens to the modern man. So you have a poem like the love song of Two Frog. Why is it given to you in your syllabus, and it is taught in all the syllabus in for English literature across most of the universities? Why? Because here's a man. The poem was published in the year 1917. The First World War has already started. So here's a man, True Frog, who goes to these English tea parties, in the afternoons and evenings, and he knows a lot of people. He socializes with the educated elite. He knows the painters and the women who talk of really high philosophy. In the room, women come and go talking of Michelangelo. So Michelangelo is a Renaissance sculptor and a painter and a philosopher. So they talk about really high stuff. They seem to be very educated women. He frequents these places where people drink in very fine china cups, and they have all the tea and the cakes and the marmalade and everything. And he wants to go and propose a woman, because the title tells us that it's a love song. So he wants to make a proposal to a woman. What is the proposal? Whether he wants to marry the woman, whether he just wants to befriend her, whether he wants to just take her out, we have no idea. Who is the woman? We have no idea. Does he say it? No, he does not. Why does he not say it? Because he's too conscious of himself. He's too anxious. He's full of anxiety. His mind keeps on dwindling. So he tells himself, Chalo chalte hain. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. It's an evening that is so sick that it reminds him of a hospital event, like a patient that has been given anesthesia. It reminds him of the image immediately becomes rather sickly. No one begins the idea of love with such a sick imagery, but he does. And just when he says let us go, so he quickly diverts. He says, let us not go inside that tea party. Let us not go inside the to the place where I am to meet that woman. Let us go to the muttering retreats, the half deserted streets, where you have cheap hotels, where people argue continuously, where there's a lot of smoke and dirt. And that cat episode, the yellow fog rubs its back upon the window panes. All that is supposed to symbolize the dirt and the squalor. And then he keeps on telling himself, do I dare? Should I presume? Should I go? What if they would tell me that no, your necktie is not right, your hands are too thin, and you're growing bald? What if they notice that spot on my head? So he's very conscious of himself. He's very uh, anxious of his own appearance. He's not decided on how he should move ahead and talk to those people, talk to those women. He's not even decided upon the women. At no place is the woman given any name, or at no place does he talk about the features of the woman. He's not even bothered about what woman is, how does she look. At one point he says, Ki, I can see their hair on the skin, I can see them, they're not very, really not very fine women. Why? Because they have not waxed properly. I know them, and I've seen them around. I know how they tilt their heads. I know how they talk. I know the kind of conversations that happen in these places. And yet, he's not very confident to navigate in that space. Why? Because he is the epitome of the modern man. He's someone who functions in the background of the war, with where the society itself is very is fragmented, where the society is not very sure of what is about to happen, because that is what happens in the times of war. War आपको बहुत jittery बनाता है, war आपको बहुत ही uncertain और unsure बनाता है. The whole perception of proof rock is from a uh, 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 is from a is that of a man who's dwindling. he has severe psychological issues, and the whole poem is an assemblage, and it keeps on referring to a lot of past poets. The idea was with T.S. Eliot, the idea was that modern poetry and the modern poet was supposed to know the tradition and then produce something new, something that is in the tradition, and yet something that is not really being said before. So he gives this idea that poetry is not a turning loose of emotions. Unlike what Wordsworth said, key poetry is an spontaneous overflow of emotions. He says, no, poetry is not a turning loose of emotions, but an escape from emotions. One should escape from the emotions. It is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. One should not talk about himself like the romantic poets or the Victorian poets were talking about. No, don't talk about it. The mind of the poet, he said, should be like just like a catalyst where events and emotions should come together and fuse into one thing. The intellect and the emotion should come and fuse into one idea, and then you should be able to produce poetry which is not just emotion and which is not just intellect. It should be a reflection of what is going on in the modern times. It should be a true reflection. It should not be not be an emotional response to the situation. So here he was very different to the traditional poets and the traditional poets and the traditional content of the poetry. So he talks about poets. He talks about poetry and poets as a part of a particular tradition. Another of the poets that is pretty famous for the modern poet is W.B. Yeats. I think the second coming has been prescribed in the first semester. Now, this particular poem gives us a very precise image of what the modern time was all about. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. This is this is the most prominent feature of the modern poetry. Things were falling apart. All the institutions, all the cherished ideas, the cherished ideals, the spaces, the people, all those things that were really dear to people. Ideas about love, ideas about family, ideas about governance, ideas about social organization, ideas about the government taking care of you, the employer taking care of you, बिकॉज वो लोग तो सरकार मालिक होते थे, वो हमारे रक्षा करने के लिए होते थे, या फिर हमारे हमारा भला भी चाहते थे. ये सारे आइडियाज जो थे वो ट्रैम्पल कर चुके थे बिकॉज of the advent of philosophers or sociologists like Freud and Marx and Nietzsche. They said that there's no one who's supposed to take care of you. There's no one who's actually taking care of you. Everybody, every man, the ideas of individualism, every man is supposed to deal with his own problems in his own manner. There's no right way, there's no wrong way. You are the modern times had rendered man rather mean and selfish. One is supposed to take care of oneself. There was no support and comfort that was available. So all this was reflected in the modern poetry. In fact, Yeats again writes a very wonderful prayer for his daughter, which is prescribed in the syllabus of Allahabad University. I'll just read a few lines from there. And he says that there's a very huge storm that is brewing outside, and his daughter is very small, lying in the cradle, and he's trying to be protective of her. So he says, once more the storm is howling, and half hid under this cradle hood and coverlid, my child sleeps on. So she's sleeping on in the cradle under the cover, but there's a storm that is brewing outside. And how is the storm? I'll just try and describe you the storm. I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour and heard the sea wind stream upon the tower. It's so horrific outside, as if the sea wind is screaming on the tower. And under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded streams. Flooded streams, the rivers, all the rivers, all the elm trees, the forest, the tar, everywhere the wind is hitting, and it's hitting with such a force, and it's that it seems as if it is howling and screaming at these features. Imagining in excited reverie that the future years had come dancing to a frenzied drum out of the murderous innocence of the sea. The murderous innocence of the sea. The innocence of the sea is rather murderous. That is how the modern times were. That is how the modern poetry was reflecting the times. Again, another poem by W.H. Auden. The poem is called 1st September 1939. I sit in one of the dives of 52nd Street. Sitting in London in one of the restaurants of 52nd Street. The name is called 52nd Street. Uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. 1st September 1939. What was 1939 famous for? The beginning of the Second World War. So he says, I'm sitting here uncertain and afraid as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. The whole decade has been low and dishonest, lowly and dishonest. That is how the society was. When you read at the literature of modern times, you see a lot of ideas which you find rather shocking or unacceptable. There are people who are talking about relationships outside marriage, the people who are talking about ideas like deification, masturbation, mensuration. There are people who are talking about women not confined to their tradition.
Ma'am, one question. Ma'am, one question. Hello.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. One question, ma'am.
Let me finish first, and then perhaps we can have a round of questions.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
So when you read the literature of the modern times, you find a lot of ideas that are pretty shocking and that are pretty unconventional and not so pleasant to your taste. And you are like, why is the poet talking about it at all? Why does he have to mention it at all? That's because the traditional society has failed him. And that is the prominent feature of the modern poetry. And I think I'll just finish off. I've given you the name of the modern poets that were writing during the during 19 early 50 years of 20th century. W.H. Auden is pretty famous. Stephen Spender is taught in school in most of the courses. CBSE में भी पढ़ाया जाता है, ICSE में भी पढ़ाया जाता है. Elizabeth Jennings was a very important female poet. Eva Dobell, Jessie Hope. These poets were the female poets who were talking about war. Then D.H. Lawrence is more famous as a novelist, but he was also a poet and a good one. Philip Larkin, again, was a movement poet. Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, and Donald Davy. These were a set of poets called the movement poets who revolted against the constructed ambiguity of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. तो एक रफली 4-5 तरह के लोग थे जो कि पोइट्री के 4-5 तरह के आइडियाज फ्लोट कर रहे थे. There was this set of people who are generally termed as the Georgian poets, who were still stuck up in the old Victorian tradition and still talking about the beauty of the Victorian life, the countryside and stuff. Then there was T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound school and the Imagism, where people were responding very crudely to the disorder in a very disordered manner. So there was no organization in their poetry. There was no seeming organization in their poetry. Although it does make sense when you read, when you think of it in terms of the post-modernist writings. Then there was another school of poets called the movement poets, who were writing very clear and concise images, but they were writing against all established norms. They were writing against the church, they were writing against family, they were writing against values of friendship and love. And they were mocking everything. They were writing in ironic tones. They were not happy with any system, and they would not be happy with any system. One of the poems that I've misplaced over here is Sylvia Plath. She was writing in the later phase of 20th century. So Sylvia Plath, I believe, should not have been here. And I think I would like to end the lecture with a quote from W.B. Yeats's Second Coming. It's prescribed in your course, and this is one of those lines which we really do not pay attention to. It's in the first stanza when you look at it, and it says that the best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. The second coming talks about the second coming of Jesus Christ, where he would not be a gentle and a meek figure like he was in the first instance. जब Jesus Christ पहली दफा आए तो वो बहुत उनको एक भेड़ से कंपेयर किया जाता है और कहा जाता है कि वो ह्यूमैनिटी का सारा दुख दर्द अपने ऊपर ले गए. So he bore the cross for the betterment of the human society. So he already paid for our sins, but we are a sinful lot, and therefore he's going to come again, and this time he's not going to forgive us. He's not going to be the forgiving kind. He's going to be the exacting kind. Why? Because the best among us lack all conviction. Conviction over here means the determination, the courage, the moral assertiveness. If we are good, I think we can do this on an individual basis, but we can do this for ourselves as well. The way we give in to our weaker passions, and we do not really have force for our own better part. The best amongst the people lack the courage, the conviction, and the determination, while the worst, the bad people, are full of passionate intensity. We have an agenda, and people who have a agenda, who are corrupt people, they do go out and do their thing, unlike the good people who just sit back and relax and criticize. So that's modern poetry for you. I think now we can open for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am, for this enlightening session.
Ma'am,
Now,
one
I'd
question.
like to invite questions from the
Yes,
participants.
yes, ma'am. Ma'am, question is that, ma'am, why does the
Yes,
modern man?
Bhuvnesh, please ask your question.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, question is why does the modern man suffer from identity crises?
I told you there's so much at the background. Identity crisis basically comes from the teachings of Freud and Marx, as well as the early people called James Fraser and Nietzsche. Identity के कुछ components होते हैं. आपके एंसेस्टर्स, आपका जोग्राफिकल एरिया, आपकी हिस्ट्री, आपके जो रेस है, जो आपका फीचर है, whether you're black or brown or white or whatever, then the language that you speak, and then you have certain ideas of interest. Sometimes I personally believe आपका काम भी आपको एक identity provide करता है, whether you're a teacher or you're whatever, so a businessman or whatever. So that also gives you a sense of identity. Identity is about how you see yourself. The modern man was not able to root himself in any specific idea. He belonged to an agrarian society. The society turned industrial. Industrialization had its promises. If you work hard, you will earn money. But when they moved to the urban areas, they were living in horrible conditions. They were living in such in such a poor manner that they felt like going back. But in life there's actually you cannot reverse the process. People who had already moved to the cities, they can no longer go back. Imagine yourselves as students and going back to your gaon and start doing kheti. Very few of us have the courage to go back to that kind of life. So maybe they did not have land enough, maybe they had no company there, maybe they had brought all their family here. So all those ideas brought in a division in the man. He had come in to the city in hope, but what he saw in front of him did not provide him any solace. Also, the governance. There was a lot of political turmoil that was going on. Earlier, there was monarchy, but the monarchy was moving into democracy. But the rights for the people were coming in slowly. Any political change takes its time to have a proper effect in the society. Also remember, this was not the age of computers and television. The television came pretty late, 1960s and 70s. So this was an age where the steam engine was developing, the aircrafts were developing, but there was also war that was around, or semi-automatic guns and stuff. So people were fighting for their own places. So Prufrock is the example of the crisis of identity. He is someone who wants love and comfort, but he's not sure whether he's going to get it, because he sees himself as an old and an ailing middle-aged person. He feels himself to be an anti-hero. He's not like the strong Samson looking man. He's someone who's frail and thin and who's growing old. And by the time the poem ends, he's actually talking about all the inconsistencies of the old age. So he's full of anxiety. Therefore, the crisis of identity in the modern man. I
Okay,
hope
ma'am.
that answers your
Thank you,
question.
ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to ask any
Yes,
question
sir.
from ma'am?
May
Yes,
I?
sir.
Yes. Yes,
Yes, sir.
please switch on your video first and then ask your question. Yes, Ashita.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. Sir, I want to ask,
Good
why do
afternoon.
modern poets use scientific images in their poetry?
Do they? Yes, they do. But remember, the scientific images that were coming to us were from the modern age. So futurism that I talked about was the art movement, and they did talk a lot about warfares. They did talk a lot about new technologies. They did talk about machineries, how industries were affecting them. They were talking about it. And Stephen Spender की एक बड़ी famous poem है regarding the steam engine, and the movement of the steam engine was supposed to depict the advent of the English society. It's a rather positive poem where he shows that the way the steam engine is moving uh, um, towards an object is the way the English society is progressing. So yes, they did talk a lot about the modern machines.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Anyone else who wants to ask question, ma'am?
Yes,
Ma'am.
sir.
Yes.
Ma'am, which
Yes,
poet
Bhavna?
is more modernist in outlook, T.S. Eliot or W.B.
Can you please repeat your question, Bhavna?
Which
We,
poet is more modernist in outlook, T.S. Eliot or W.B. Yeats?
Okay, W.B. Yeats is actually known as one of the last romantics, because he does talk about he held very aristocratic notions. If you look at W.B. Yeats today, you will be very disturbed about the ideas that he held. He believed in the power of aristocracy. हम जमींदार हैं, बाकी सारे लोग हमारे नीचे हैं, but he was one of those benevolent patriarchs. He believed that he was the man who should be taking care of his subjects, who should be taking care of everybody around, unlike the democratic idols that we have today. So he's not really the modern man. The modern times may democracy becomes the prime force. So that way even Eliot is sometimes said to be rather anti-Semitic. He did not like the Jews, and was a classicist in religion. He believed in Roman Catholic religion, which is supposed to be a rather orthodox form of religion. So they had their own perceptions and views which are not considered very modern from today's perspective, but amongst the two of them, between the two of them, it was T.S. Eliot who's supposed to be more modern. Also because he brought in the idea of the convoluted syntax and the broken images and constructed ambiguity. He would make it ambiguous to show to the people that look, our society is not comprehensible, and therefore we are not going to talk in very clear terms. अगर हमें खुद कुछ नहीं साफ समझ में आ रहा है तो हम तुम्हें जो समझाएं वो साफ क्यों हो. So that way he's supposed to be more modern.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. Any other student who wants to ask question?
Just to taper it off,
Okay,
so modernity was basically a breaking down of the conventional order in the conventional society, how people saw it. Religion has failed them, governance has failed them, their immediate family life and their relationships have failed them in a certain manner. Postmodernism is what comes after the Second World War, where they started celebrating it. So postmodernism was mostly about mocking. So when you look at the modernist poets and the writers today, and from the perspective of postmodernism, you will find them still rather traditional. Okay, so modernism has its own subjectivity.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am, for such a wonderful lecture. I wanted to discuss one more point related to the lines from the second coming that you have discussed, that the best lack all conviction, whereas the worst are full of passionate intensity. So, does it suggest, ma'am, that evils in society start flourishing just because of the lack of conviction from those people who actually can restrict the spread of evil in society?
Do they, your question is, do they restrict?
Does it suggest that, yes, ma'am, can the flourishing of evils in society be possible only when those people who have the capability to restrict evil in society, they actually become inactive? As we find the examples from Mahabharata, if we go into our mythology, so even in Mahabharata took place just because of that battle of Mahabharata took place just because of the lack of conviction to stand with dharma by those warriors who could actually defend dharma. So does this line
Dinkar wrote
also
those.
has some kind of relation?
Dinkar wrote those famous lines. जो तटस्थ हैं समय लिखेगा उनका भी अपराध.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So not doing anything is basically pandering to the evil ideology. So I think Yeats is telling us the same thing. And this plays at multiple levels. It plays at the societal level, it plays at the individual level, and I think it plays within the individual as well. We let the best among the best qualities of us not take over the weaker part of us. we just lazy around, we don't do anything, we don't indulge in the creative ideas. And in between the individuals, we can say that people who have an agenda, an evil agenda. Suppose it's a very pertinent topic to talk about. Suppose somebody wants to get an admission to the college, koi minister ka beta hai, so that person has an agenda and he wants to get it done, unqualified, not really deserving that admission. But I know the situation and I'm not doing anything right about it. I'm not participating in that debate altogether. So somewhere I'm not even pushing that person back. So I think I'm wrong as well. If I do that, I'm wrong as well. So that's what TSL Yates had to say. Yates was rather moralistic in his stance, I think.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an enlightening lecture from your side. And I hope that our students might have benefited a lot with this enlightening lecture. Their level of understanding might have gone in a more positive direction towards the understanding of modern poetry in a better way. Now I invite Dr. Shefali Jam, our colleague, to say vote of thanks. Dr.
Thank
Shefali,
you,
ma'am.
sir. Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone, all presents here. It's an honor to have been asked to offer a vote of thanks on this occasion of guest lecture. On behalf of my college, Shri Prem Prakash Memorial College, Tirthankar Mahavir University, Moradabad, I, Dr. Shefali Jain, would like to express my gratitude to all esteemed delegates of this lecture for their presence and contribution to make this a great success. First of all, I extend my gratitude to our respected director, sir, to take out time from his busy schedule to grace this event. Now, I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Fatima Noori ma'am with these lines. फूल खिलते हैं जब आप मुस्कुराते हैं, फूल खिलते हैं जब आप मुस्कुराते हैं, जहां जाते हैं चार चांद लगाते हैं, जहां जाते हैं चार चांद लगाते हैं, उस मंच की शोभा के क्या कहने, उस मंच की शोभा के क्या कहने, जहां आप जैसे अतिथि आते हैं, जहां आप जैसे अतिथि आते हैं. Ma'am, it has been pleasure to have you here with us and providing immense knowledge about this topic and also make the student understand the concept of modern poetry clear. Now, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Rashmi Malhotra ma'am, Principal of Faculty of Education, and Dr. Ashok Lakhwada sir, Principal of SPPMC College, for giving their great support time to time. Now, I may like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Ramnath Kesharwani sir for organizing such a knowledgeable and encouraging meeting. Now, I must thank our all faculty members, our dearest students for giving presence and contribution to make this meeting a great success and taking active participation. Thanks you everyone once again for making it a great success. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you all participants, students, and all their members, faculty members. Thank you.
Delete करना पड़ेगा.